So yeah, Edison, finishing your question, and Cynthia, if you want to jump in and help and begin the conversation, Edison was asking a question about what would constitute a good source for a literature review. And I'm saying, well, we have the idea that peer-reviewed articles, sometimes thesis dissertations, book chapters are good, but I would say, for example, steer clear from blogs unless it's something like a really reputable blog. And definitely, I would say, don't ever use an don't ever cite an unpublished manuscript as part of your review or as a foundational block to your own work, because then you're like, well, why are you citing an unpublished manuscript? If it's that important, that should have been published, even if it's even if it's as great literature. Again, there are occasions where we cannot, because we don't have the time, that we cannot submit that for publication. So you just publish it as great literature on a working paper series. The ERIC, the Educational Resources database from the Department of Education, they accept submissions. So you have a conference paper that you, again, for one reason or another, you could not submit for publication. You don't want to lose it. Simply send it, submit it to ERIC. They don't do peer review, but ERIC is curated. There are people who actually read it and they make sure it fits the standards of publication they have. And if they accept it, then you can cite it. You can actually include your CV and you can cite it as part of your publications and as part of the work you're doing. But whatever you do, don't ever start with an unpublished manuscript and saying, "Oh, this is a fundamental part of my problem," because that is gonna make you look a lot worse than you think it does. But Manuela, let's see if you can turn on your microphone. Okay, you said you had a question.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, so my question is related about what you were talking about. Of course, that our researches are not going to be unique, and there are going to be lots and lots of other documents that are going to talk about our research. And most of the time, if not every single time, those research at the end, in the conclusion, they give some suggestions and recommendations for further investigation. My question is, can we use those recommendations? How bad is it? Is it good? Is it correct? Can we use those recommendations just for our own research?
Okay, before I answer the question, and that's a very, very good question, so we're not going to lose it. It's just because we already have our second guest just popped up. So I'm going to stop and we're going to get to your question, I promise. And if I don't get to your question, I'm very sure Cynthia is going to do something terrible to me later on. So I will get to your question. I don't think they will know that she'll send me something terrible in the back channels. So I'm not going to get back to your question. But I want to take a moment to really open the microphone and floor for two of our guests. Now we're waiting for the third guest to show up eventually. To give them a moment to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their research background, and again the question that we asked last night at the webinar: what compelled you to become a qualitative researcher in the first place? So we have again two wonderful scholars and beautiful people in Dr. Cynthia Langtiw and Dr. Boni Wozolek. So I'm gonna open the microphone for the two of you to introduce yourselves to the crowd and to the people who are watching this on YouTube.
Sure. How much time do we have? Like, what brought me to qualitative research?
Well,
so my name is Cynthia Langtiw, and I'm a clinical psychologist and a Haitian American clinical psychologist, as well as a professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. I'm based here in Chicago, and we too are quarantined. So it's really great to be able to see warm qualitative faces. So long story short, what brought me to qualitative research is being Haitian. I think that I realized along the way that so much of what I've learned about how to be in the world are from the stories that I was told, the stories that built Haiti, the stories that built my family. And as I've come to understand myself as a systemic and community psychologist as well, the way that I understand how to understand others and to be understood is through stories. And it comes from the very foundations of my cultural being. And so I think that for me, being a qualitative researcher is part of my cultural foundation and is the space from which I move as I try to understand my place in the world, my connection to others in the world, and help others connect in the world through understanding. There's so much more in there, but I would say that it's cultural. I'm Haitian, so I'm qualitative, y'all.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Yeah, and I think yeah, that's important. Like, we have talked about this in the class. Just to give Boni and Cynthia a little bit more context, we talked. I mean, this idea of positionality and how our positionalities are above everything, intersectional, and that everything you are affects the research you do. That you can, and you cannot research what you're not. So I mean, I like the fact that Cynthia just mentions to me that I'm Haitian, and that drives my work. And because she says I'm Haitian, y'all, and yeah, and by the way, she cooks delicious Haitian food. But just to I had to do the shout out because I'm so sad I don't get to have the Haitian food because we're not going to ICQI.
Next year.
Next year we'll do. Now, Boni.
So thank you for that. You know, one of the things, Raúl, did I hear you correctly? You said you can't research what you are not. Is that?
Well, kind of in the sense that it's difficult if you're not part of something to really start looking at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. That's hard for me, actually. So I'm just picking up on that, and I'm not intentionally pushing back in that way, but one of the thoughts that I have is that when we think about ethnographic roots, that's specifically a history that is connected to a lot of times to what people were not, right? Now, there are marginalizing factors and there are a lot of things that are included in that I think we really do need to consider. But I think right now we're in this era of identity politics where we have decided that you have to be in order to think about what people are and how they move in the world and just how they be in general, right? Yeah. And so I know that you didn't mean it by that comment, but I think it's worth taking the time to push back. I sit sort of at the intersection of a lot of things, right? So my father is from Goa, India. My mom is from the United States. I'm bilingual, English and Spanish, but not because Spanish was a language that I grew up speaking. It was a language that people would speak to me. And so I had to learn a totally separate language just because people would look at me and assume an identity, right? And so there was always for me a question of identity versus identified. I sit at an intersection of sexuality with bisexuality. And so I think the reason that I was pulled toward qualitative research was very much this question of how do we make sense of the world? And what does it mean to make sense of the world? And when you sit at the intersection of a lot of things, language, race, sexual orientation, all of those things, there's a lot of, well, you're not brown enough, you're not queer enough or straight enough, you don't speak Spanish well enough, you don't, right? Like all of these things become your reality. And so for me, I was really drawn toward qualitative research, not only because of my own story, trying to figure out how do I make sense of the world as something that is often perceived as a neither nor, right? The amount of times, even as a woman of color with a doctorate, I still get asked the question, what are you? By other people who have doctorates, right? So, you know, it's one of those things I was always sort of very curious about how is it that we understand the world? And then I was working with youth of color and queer youth in an overwhelmingly white place. And so, you know, watching them struggle with them being in the margins and what does it mean to live in the margins and be in the margins and make sense of being marginalized altogether. And so for me, it wasn't just qualitative research, but specifically ethnographic research. And then pulling in a little bit more specific than that is looking at the senses, following my dissertation advisor's work of sonic studies. So how do we learn through sound? We are so tied to the ocular in this world, in the Western world, I should say. You know, seeing is believing is what some people like to say. And yet if we were to actually listen deeply to each other, not only through our daily lives, but through qualitative research, this question of how do we learn differently through that sort of work as well.
Well, that's I mean, yeah, and I agree with everything you have said in the sense of how we construct the phenomenon. I think that you said something very important at the end. And before I make the comment, Walter, if you're watching this, we're sending you our love, because I mean you just got shouted out here, Walter Gershon. I guess we're gonna have to have you soon in a webinar here. Uh, yeah, I'm calling you out, Walter Gershon. I'm making it official.
You might not see you at ICQI, but he will call you out from where he's at. So that's serious.
I know. Oh, I know. And that's why I like our Walter. But I like the idea of really this idea of part of doing qualitative research is actually the possibility of listening. That, and I think in many aspects, I think qualitative research should be more about listening to others than us trying to speak. That sometimes I think real researchers really talk too much sometimes, in the sense of we talk too much, but we don't let the participants speak, and we don't listen to the participants enough. And I think that level of developing this sense of we're there to listen to the stories and share the stories that we heard, trying to be as respectful and honor the stories as much as possible, that needs to permeate the entire act of doing qualitative research.
Absolutely.
So I absolutely agree with that. And yes, and now we're gonna go back to the question now, because the students have a lot of questions. I mean, we really have 2 or 3 people with questions. So we're gonna return to Manuela, and we're gonna ask you to restate the question so we can discuss it.
Well, before you do that, 2 things.
Yeah.
First of all,
Go
I
ahead.
should probably say that I'm at Penn State Abington, which is just outside of Philadelphia in the United States, as an assistant professor. I always miss the part where I should actually introduce where I'm at now rather than where I've been in the world. And the other thing is I have a 2-year-old who is going to be coming up here in a minute. The door is locked, but they seem to know how to pick locks. So if I step away for a minute, I will be right back.
It's well, don't worry. I think we're gonna people who were watching the earlier part of the webinar, they already may have heard the ruckus from Connor and Duncan. So I think we're, as far as that goes, we're good. So we can definitely deal with that. So Manuela, we're gonna go back to your question right now.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So my question was related to when we are looking at the literature review and checking all the other resources, of course, we find that some of them have pretty similar things to the one we want to develop, the one we want to carry out. And of course, most of the time, all these research have at the end some recommendations for further investigation. So how good is it, or how can I take these recommendations into my research?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really beautiful question, right? And for me, I would take a step back and I would ask, toward what end would you take those recommendations into how you think about not just your research, but the broader question? How does this particular related, tangential, oppositional even research illuminate your original question, and how can it help you then deepen whatever question it is that you have? And so I often think of whatever research is out there as having to make it into our lit review, having to help us to expand or answer part of the central question. And in that way, like that's the sort of barometer that I always ask for an article as it's trying to knock on the door and come into the lit review. How are you going to help me answer my bigger question? How are you going to help me expand my bigger question? And I would say to ask the same questions about the recommendations. Great question, Manuela. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to that is to remember that just because there are recommendations does not mean that you need to follow those recommendations. The person who wrote that article, while they are certainly hopefully an expert in what they're doing, they are not your intellectual parent, so to speak. So you don't necessarily need to listen to everything. It's a recommendation. It's something that you can use to guide your thoughts, but doesn't need to be something that takes over your thoughts. Yeah. And so, you know, I think recommendations are important to drive the field forward. And sometimes recommendations, we give those because that's what we need to think through further in our own articles, right? So your line of inquiry does not need to be that person's line of inquiry. I think it's really important to make sure that you establish yourself in that way. That would be my only thing that I would add to that, just to make sure that your voice is your voice in the research. Your questions are your questions. And while those things might inform what you do, or make you think about how the field is moving in a particular way, maybe that's something that you add, say, into your literature review. Yes, the field is moving this way. It's indicated by these questions that are asked across these contexts, but that doesn't mean that your research has to be that.
Yeah, and I would even add further that even if you listen to the recommendations, doesn't mean you have to follow the recommendations. I mean, those are two different things right there. Listening to the recommendations and following the recommendations. What I mean is you can really use that as some kind of as a sort of inspiration, but not exactly do what they're suggesting in the article. But you can say, well, what I'm doing kind of aligns with this, and sometimes that makes it easier to build the case. To saying that, yeah, I am listening to the recommendations, and this fits within this larger series of ideas where I could fit my article. And it doesn't, and you can, and if you just say, for example, you just want to listen to one recommendation from all the articles in the review, it's perfectly okay. You, at the same time, you have the option not to follow any of the recommendations, just make sure that you have, I mean, that you actually took the time to read what they had to say. So as I said, make informed choices. That's the key here, making informed choices. Whichever way you go, sometimes the question itself will tell you, and the problem itself will tell you which way to go. And I'm going to now, Ana Maria, now I'm going to, yeah. Now, so you have a question, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I did my first approximation to my research project last semester. So it's because I started in another master program because I didn't know that UPB program exists. But when I realized of this program, I decided to change the program. So, and I had some literature review in Spanish because the another master was in Spanish. So I want to know if I can use them because they are important for me, for my research. So, and if so, I don't know how to use, I suppose I have to translate or not. Or how can I use?
Boni, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah. I think part of it is a programmatic question that I can't necessarily answer. And so I don't know if your program allows bilingual submissions, meaning that you might be able to just get away with having things not translated or having the footnote of the actual text and then your translation of it for transparency's sake. So what you're running into is that, what I assume you're running into anyway, is that language doesn't always translate exactly and the ideas don't always translate exactly. And so I think part of it is that you're going to have to be really careful about that, making sure that you're transparent about the ideas from one language and one culture, literally pulled into a colonized language, right? Or the language of the colonizers, and what that means, and what that might mean for your participants and for your research altogether. And I think I wouldn't say that you shouldn't be able to use it, right? I mean, I've used texts that are not written in English and done translation, but I've been very careful about the transparency about what that means to use it not in its own language.
Okay.
Now, I'll add up to that question because, I mean, as you said, there is part that is program. I mean, it's kind of like program directed, but in the answer in the case of the program is there is absolutely no problem. I think personally, my advice to our students is when you're going to do your research, use all the languages you have at your disposal and survey the literature in all the languages that you have at your disposal. If you, I mean, I can remember from my own dissertation, I read articles in French, and when I had to go back and look at Paulo Freire, I decided, well, I'm going to go back and look at Paulo Freire in Portuguese. And when I had to read Bourdieu, I went back and looked at Bourdieu in French. Because there is an element of looking at, so especially even looking at some of the source material in the original language that gives you, and even in some cases I would write my own translations because that, and I would say I make a note, my translation, just because this is my interpretation of the text. In terms of the literature, the very specific case of the literature you already have, I would find it pointless to disregard it just because it's in Spanish. It would be pointless. It would be counterproductive. And in fact, our program is in second language studies, so it's like second languages. It's not even English. It's second languages. So, but by definition, is all the languages you have at your disposal. So if you can find literature in other languages, you're more than welcome. I don't see, again, it would be pointless to say, oh no, it has to be just literature written in English. No, you have to write the report in English. The literature you want to bring to the table, there is lots of literature in Spanish that you may find useful. We might have to discuss, the issue of whether you should translate the quotations or not. That's a different matter for a different day. And then there is, of course, the issue that will come up later and how we handle participants' quotes if they don't if the interviews in Spanish. But that's a different matter for a different course. Mm-hmm. But TLDR, yes, the literature you already have accumulated and you're using your previous proposal, it's perfectly okay. And I would strongly recommend you do it, that you continue using that and adding more literature in other languages.
And I want to add to that too. First of all, I think I said, I want to be really clear about Spanish and English, both being language of colonizers. The difficulty that's there for Indigenous folks and for all of us as brothers and sisters in that way. Also, I want to remind you that the languages we speak inform who we are, right? And in the literature, it is informing the field in those languages, much in the way that language is so deeply ontologically connected to us, right? I grew up in a household where my father spoke 7 languages and did not speak any of them to me because he didn't want us to be more marginalized than we already were in a predominantly white town. And so I had to learn a second language on my own, and it wasn't even the language that one of the languages that my father spoke. And so when we think about that, when we think about even the way that my father the way his body moves differently when he's speaking in one of his home tongues, what that means when your whole way of being changes. And I like to think of fields in that way, still connected to the languages we speak. And so don't ditch part of what you've already found within the ontoepistemology of the field, right? Just because you've switched programs. That would be, my bigger advice for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I so appreciate that. And I actually want to loop back a couple of statements in answering this question and sitting with your idea of sitting on the cusp and intersectionality and how that's so much related. And what I was going to say at that point when you were talking about being at that crux and cusp and, bringing so many of those pieces and that being the central sort of idea around intersectionality is that that's what brings your unique voice to the table and your unique way of organizing, understanding the different, not just languages, but what brings them together for you in the question. And I really appreciate that you're bringing this question forward because I think, having been at this for a while, that in prior years that your kind of question, your voice, you're bringing that cusp to the table would have been marginalized and perhaps continues to be marginalized. And yet that is how and where we will move forward in understanding not just language, but how language is situated, understood, developed, spoken, learned. And we want to understand the fullness of that. And you're bringing these questions that are seemingly on the side for someone else to deal with are the very questions that we need to ask. And you're probably not the first person to have that question, but having it present as a main part of the dialogue as opposed to the side dialogue is, I think, what's really beautiful about where we are right now. And I encourage you and all of these other voices on the margins to bring these ideas and voices and troublings to the center because they are the center, they are the thing. You're trying to figure out whether or not you should bring these Spanish language articles into this writing is the question, is the thing that we're doing, is the work that we have been troubling, need to trouble, and need to continue to trouble until it's not a question. And, you know, I have, as a, an editor on several journals, I have lots of thoughts about like how we force folks into language, but that's a whole other class.
No, it is a whole other class. I mean, even something as simple as the issue of English itself and the kind of English we're expecting students to write in. Like, that's an issue that I have to deal with in several journals already, saying no, and that we have to advocate for whatever variant you speak should be welcome into the table and not have to deal with the traditional copy editor request of have your paper reviewed by a native speaker before we publish it.
Okay,
That
thank you.
sometimes we get. So again, your question, Anna, is very relevant because it has to do, again, with what languages make it to the table when you are doing your research. And the answer is, again, all of them, all the languages you can manage here's regardless of how proficient you are in them. I mean, if you can read text in any given language and that text can support your research study, bring it on. Yeah, that the reviewers cannot read text in French or Spanish. Well, that is not your problem. I mean, you just use the literature that you can read, and they'll have and the reviewers will have to make do because that's sometimes the way it is. Yeah. So yeah, so but definitely, and that goes for everybody. You can survey articles in English and in Spanish and in Portuguese and in any other language that we may. I mean, I don't necessarily may be able to understand, but if you think that the article supports your cause and supports the case, it's more than welcome into the literature, into all the literature that you're going to be using throughout the study.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Are there any other questions, or do I have time to start picking Cynthia's and Boni's brains a little bit about the lit review? Because the question, again, the topic for today's webinar is putting together a lit review. And we already had the first part, some ideas and some definition it's more like the class thing, but this is more the question of lived experience. And the question here is, when it's time to start working on the lit review, what do you do?
Cynthia, do you want to tackle that first, or?
What do I do? Yeah, so I actually have a couple of thoughts that hold on, what did I do? Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts that tend to help me under the auspices of 3 big questions. And I actually am gonna put in the chat here a book that I really enjoy and my students, that I have my students use, and it's, I don't know if you can see it, that I have my students use, 6 steps. Let me get the actual title. But then there are 3 big organizing questions that I'm going to, with a couple of subpoints that I think help me and that I talk to my students about as we're working. So here's the book in the chat. It's called 6 Steps to a Successful Literature Review, the Literature Review, 6 Steps to Success. And I really like this approach. It's by Machi and McAvoy. And they talk about, just steps to the lit review and making sure that it's a lit review specifically leading towards a research project, and so an advanced lit review. So having said that, can I jump into the 3 big questions that I asked myself? Okay, so yeah, and and I thought about these, of course, because as a qualitative researcher, I was thinking about the elements of qualitative research that I bring into the lit review. So there are 3 big questions that I ask myself, and I think about the literature as data, right? And so when I think about the literature as data, qualitative data, if you will, there are questions that help me organize. So I think about how I gather the data, I think about how I analyze the data, and I think about how I present the data, right? And so first of all, like when I'm starting a lit review, like I sit and I meditate right? And I ask myself, why am I asking these questions? Why is this interesting to me? What's my connection? So under the how do we gather the data is that I think about my own researcher position. What are the biases that I bring to the table? How am I connected or disconnected from this question, population, group? And in what ways will that enter the project, right? And then of course, from a qualitative perspective, I think bottom up, not top down, right? So I examine what hidden hypotheses may be in there for me and unpack those so that I'm making sure that I'm asking and gathering as broad a scope of data around the topic as possible, right? So I'm taking responsibility for my researcher position so that I can be bottom up, not top down. And then I think about how I'll analyze the data or the literature. How do I then, having all of these articles before me, right, and ideas, how do I critically go through those, summarize them, and make connections between them, right? And how do I make sense of the connections that I'm making between them? How do I understand how all of this will bring me to a central question worthy of answering, right? And then how do I present the data? How do I build an important research question from all of these connections that I've made? And how do I make sure that in that final research question that I'm owning, going back to that first piece, that I'm owning my researcher position, my perspective, my bias, all of these pieces. So those are three big questions that I ask myself, and you can substitute, literature for data. How do I gather the data? Owning my stuff. How do I analyze the data, right? Making the connections. And then how do I present it, right? In a way that leads me to a solid research grounded question. So that's all I have around that. And that was a lot, but feel free to dig in and ask questions or,
Raúl, do you want me to talk? And all right, I didn't know if anyone had any questions immediately. I didn't want to speak.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Yeah, and actually really I think far more organized than I am with these things. So I think for me, I think the first thing I always ask myself is what is your bias? And so I really do think, and I ask myself that as a checkpoint consistently as I'm doing the research for the literature review. Mm-hmm. So every so once in a while, I check in with myself and I say like, okay, well, what bias are you carrying with yourself as much as possible? Because these things are so many times hidden to the speaker. And then, going back and asking that several times. And I think that's important to helping me really think through that I'm doing what I think I'm doing, so that my intentions match my actions and things like that. The next thing I do is, for me, the literature review tells a story. It tells a story of not just a field, it tells a story of fields. And so when I sit down to start thinking about the literature, I just allow myself the pleasure of intellectually wandering for a while. I think that's the most important. It's one of the parts of my job that I really happen to love, the ability to intellectually wander. I mean, I get paid to think. It's kind of cool. And so, I'll sit down and I'll read just a couple of pieces, and then I look at their references and I think, okay, well, who did they read? And why did they read that, right? Like, how did that weave into what they were trying to tell me through their article? And then I start thinking to myself, after I have a pretty good, and I'll read, and I usually actually take notes on each article and then start drawing arrows. Okay, well, this one related to this one, and this still left me with this question. And then I start thinking like, okay, well, what other fields might be having this similar conversation? I'm a big fan of sewing together fields. I think if we aren't thinking about not just locally within our own field, but more globally toward other disciplines, the interdisciplinary work, we're potentially missing some really important narratives, even if it's jumping out of the qualitative field and into a more quantitative field. I really do want to know what they're saying and thinking and doing with these ideas. And so that's what I do. So I let myself wander in one field and then across fields, and then I take a look at my notes, and then I think again about my own bias. And then I start asking myself like, okay, well, what from all of these things that I've read, once I hit a saturation point, right, I start noting that things are iterative, and okay, well, I've heard that before. Well, where did I hear that, and why is it different? And then I ask myself, well, what are the main themes in one field, right? So then I say like, okay, well, this is the field I particularly want to focus on. What are the themes from that field? And then I say, well, okay, well, how is this interrelated to other things that I've read from perhaps other fields? And then I start letting those things tack back and forth in a particular way. And then when I write the literature review itself, it's telling the story, right? It's telling the story of the data, going back to what Cynthia said, of these ideas. And the other thing that I want to say is that the story can be told lots of ways. I always tell my students, don't forget about the power of citations, because in a citation, if you have more than one, it's not necessarily, okay, well, these two people support me. Sometimes it's actually using a citation or string of citations to tell the story of a field, right? So it's not just that I'm saying, in my case, I do a lot of work in schools. Particularly, I work with marginalized youth, students of color, and queer and questioning youth in schools. And so I'll say, okay, well, if I say that there's a longstanding history of marginalizing African Americans in schools in the United States, and then I give a string of citations that starts with Anna Julia Cooper in 1892, and then works its way up, that's telling a story of the voices, right? Men versus women who have been saying these things. It's telling a story of the race sometimes of people who have been saying it. It's telling the story of dates, right? How long have they been saying this? And so when you work these things into a literature review, I always tell my students, don't forget that those citations are telling us something, not just who agrees with you, but it's telling you something about, it's telling another type of a story. And so for me, I always tell my students, break it down that way. What are the stories, not just what are the themes, right? But what are the stories that we're telling, and why are they being told this way? And then, building an argument. So I think that one of the largest trappings that a lot of students have is that they tend to just tell the literature, well, this person said this, and this person said this, right? And it becomes, I don't know, almost like a game show where if they can quote a bunch of people. Cynthia's like nodding her head vigorously. I can tell that you've read this. But really, when you look at it less like that and more like trying to show the forest and then zoom in on a couple of trees, which is a little bit different, it allows us to have a different type of a picture. So the literature review is your chance to make an argument, right? And so please make that argument for whatever, because full transparency, this is what qualitative research does. It's not just reporting on the data, you're making an argument for something that the data says. So tell us what this data said, and own the fact that you're making an argument about that data, because you cannot make everyone's argument all the time. You are saying that this is important for this work because of this. And so allow yourself the transparency of that kind of work. Some people just make it sound like, oh, the literature review is this neutral thing that exists. It's never not political. It's always political. Please make sure that you understand that you are entering into this political endeavor. And so when you start the writing process, then it's worth being transparent with yourself and then with your readers about how you have decided to engage politically with a field.
Yeah, I really love. I love the answers. Yeah, that we heard from Cynthia and Boni, and yeah, because earlier we kind of talked about the idea that the lit review is not that long list of summaries that maybe sometimes students make that, yeah, right, 30 summaries or 30 articles. Like, no, it's the clusters, the connections. And again, as Boni beautifully stated, stories. I think that's an important element of doing qualitative inquiry for all the younger researchers. A lot of the work we do in qualitative inquiry, and Edison, you know that we have talked about this before. Edison is one of my former master's students, who's one of my teaching assistants, hoping that he'll teach the course in the future, along with Zadie, my other teaching assistant. And one of the questions you always say is, what's the story you want to tell?
Yeah.
What is the story you want to tell? And I think that goes from the moment you say the problem all the way, and kind of ripples down all the way to the implications. So I love the part of, yeah, you want to tell us a story about what the literature told you. What's the story? And let the data, in this case, the literature, drive the story. But it's not, and I think it's important to really remind students that a lit review is very different from an annotated bibliography. We kind of talked about earlier, and they have an assignment in the class that they have to start by making an annotated bibliography. which later, much later, is going to become a lit review. But it's like, okay,
Rose,
yes, Edison.
and another specific thing, I remind that you told us some minutes ago that it was that it's necessary. Don't feel afraid in making decisions at the time of making the story, because you are who is planning everything. You are who is writing the story. You are who is identifying all the situations into the films. So I really recommend, for example, if you are writing your literature review, it is necessary try to make decisions without afraid. Yeah, because at the first time, obviously, we are writing, we are making the story, but that's why we have some advisors in order to guide our path. Yeah, because most of the time we have good ideas, but we are afraid in input that ideas into the papers just because we believe that they are not powerful as we believe. So making decisions, but making decisions with the literature, making decisions is because we have the sense in as our interesting guests are talking about is making decisions is because you are sure that you are talking about one specific story. I mean, if you don't talk on a story, it's not your thesis, it's not your literature review, it's not an original literature review.
Thank you so much for that. When you said, Boni, the literature review is always political, you know, I just wanted to shout to the rooftops. And I think that echoes what you just said, Edison. You know, this idea that we can go into it with this full neutrality and that we present this sort of crisp, clean, um, um, what's the word, scrubbed clean literature view devoid of our voice is false. And the extent to which we try to do that, Edison, I think you're right, is the extent to which we don't really dig in the ways that we are and that we need to. And Boni, to your point, owning that, you know, owning that the literature review is in fact political and that we are taking a stance no matter what it is that we end up saying. And how then can we, in naming that, then take responsibility for the stance that we're taking grounded in the literature. And to your point again, Edison, like, you know, going back to principles of qualitative research, having that peer review, having that consultation where we're asking others, like, what voice do you hear here? This is what I want to represent. These are the values that are important to me. In what ways am I imparting them? In what ways do you hear my bias in this? And, you know, bias isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you're taking a political stance and clear about it, then go for it, you know, stand and but also grounded in the literature more broadly. So thank you both. Like, I'm all here for it.
Yeah, and I want to go back to one thing, and I actually put it in the chat, and I quoted sewing together fields that Bonnie was talking about, because we talked earlier that, yeah, a lot of the work that the students are doing right now, it's going to be largely informed by the field of TESOL, but TESOL cannot be the only field that informs the work, because, and I said, you have to treat this as an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary affair, where you're going to find things that are in psychology or things that are in linguistics, that things that are in applied linguistics, things that are in literacy studies, things that are in sociology, anthropology. I remember when I had to do my dissertation, I had to read anthropological journals, and I had to read journals in psychology, and I had to read journals in sociology. And occasionally, because I needed to make sure I wasn't missing an article because it was published in a journal that was not in my field, but it was relevant to the case. So, I mean, you have to really broaden, as you broaden the options of languages, as Ana Maria broadened the question, you also have to broaden the fields that you're exploring. You cannot cover every field, that's for sure, but you have to go beyond the traditional square meter that you have been operating until you started your research project. Otherwise, you're not going to get a broader picture of what the field looks like. So I think it's a very important idea of sewing together stories and going beyond the usual field where you operate.
And I do want to be really clear that this is not an opportunity to cherry pick an argument
Uh-huh.
from
Mhm, mhm.
fields, right?
Oh,
When
yeah.
I say sew together fields, this is not, okay, well, sociology says this better than new materialisms, and therefore I'm going to pick one from here and one from here, and
Mhm.
that's my argument. Part of the transparency is saying, you know, actually this field might not necessarily agree with this concept, or they sit in relation to each other, but not necessarily in complete connection to each other. And so, and here's why. So when you start the work of sewing together fields, from my perspective, that's actually some of the harder work that I do, because first of all, on one hand, you cannot be an expert in all things. You have to be able to sit and say, actually, that's not my project. Some of the more senior scholars that I know and deeply respect have the ability to look at you and say, yeah, that's not my project, and move on with their lives in a way that I don't think I can. But I think it's important to think, okay, well, what is and what isn't your project? And why is it your project? And then the work of actually, when you sew things together, there are things that are not going to work. And you're going to have to ask yourself why they're not working. And then you're going to have to write about that at some point, to be transparent about, well, I've chosen these fields. These things are not necessarily congruent, but I'm still choosing them because of this. Those sorts of really clarifying sentences in literature reviews, I find to be really helpful for students, for myself too, to say the purpose of this is, right? Something really, it sounds super basic, but the second you have to say the purpose of using this field is whatever, it forces you into making that argument. And the other thing that I would do as you're trying to put together your literature is this idea of the elevator speech. So when, I don't know if it's just going to graduate school and getting a PhD, but people in the United States anyway tend to ask you like, oh, what's your elevator speech? And what they're asking you for is to be able to define what you're doing and the time it would take to go from one floor to another floor or a certain space on an elevator. And I always thought to myself, like, there are times that I was hoping for just one floor and times I was hoping for 20 floors on that elevator. But if you can sit there, and I do encourage my students at some point in time before the literature review is written, to sit down and give each other their elevator speech. What is the argument that's being made here? And you have 2 minutes to do it, go. And they don't like that activity at first, but generally after a little bit, I think that it's helpful because they have to be able to articulate what they're thinking. And we do it a couple of times. So I would recommend that you lean on each other as colleagues in your class, and do those sorts of exercises throughout your program, just to be able to be clear about what you're thinking and saying and doing.
Yeah, that's such a great idea, you know, to practice the elevator speech. Related to that, and I really appreciate that being succinct. One of the things that I call my students to think about is at the end of your literature review, so you have chapters 1, 2, here you are, you're moving towards that proposed methodology. At the end of your literature review, you should have a purpose statement, right, that tells us where we're going. And that purpose statement, when I read it, having read your literature review and in Boni's words, you know, the story that you've told in sewing all these fields together, I should come to your purpose statement and be like, oh yeah, of course this is what they're doing in response to what they've brought together. Like that's where you should lead me. So your literature review is leading me in this beautiful story towards that purpose statement. So then when I go to read your methodology, I think, well, of course, this is how they would answer that question, right? Or this was one of the ways that they came up with that. And along the lines of your exercise, like for every project, I ask about a refinement of a title, Boni, and it's one of the hardest things to do. And I find that a title helps you to pull it all together, right? And your purpose statement should be reflected in your title, right? Like I shouldn't be surprised, right? When I get to your purpose statement. And so that's something as you're writing the lit review to keep practicing. What do I want my title to be? What story do I want to tell here? What big burning question do I want to answer? And how's the lit review helping me gather the things that I need to help to come to the solid question that would lead me towards a project?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to start. First of all, yeah, I agree with Boni's statement about it's not cherry picking, and because you have to be careful, it's using the literature to really tell the story, not necessarily to manipulate the literature into forcing what you want people to hear. It's using it again, and I love the word idea of transparency. It's using the literature and doing a thorough review of it as you construct that story that supports the importance and the need for your study. About the elevator speech, actually, in this course, I have the last assignment they have to do is the 3-minute thesis presentation. So I actually have them do the 3-minute I actually have them do two things. And in research one, they have to do a 3-minute thesis video, and it can be a viral video, the smartphone. I mean, even I actually have like kind of like smartphone 3-minute talk. Don't do the whole, no, just as minimalist as possible. And then in research two, in addition to writing the full proposal, they have to submit a poster. So I have them do the proposal, and they have to write the poster, kind of like make a poster session kind of thing, where they summarize the essential points. Because in a poster, you cannot put 40 pages in one poster. You have to really go to the heart of the matter, because I think it's important, the ability to synthesize, the ability to tell that, I mean, yeah, kind of like bring it down to one tweet. Can you kind of, you know, I mean, you have seen that on Twitter, people going like, explain your thesis, explain your dissertation topic to a 7-year-old, or, I mean, I've seen those exercises on Twitter all the time, like explain your research to a 7-year-old, or explain your research in one tweet. And I think sometimes as scholars, we forget that particular skill, the ability to synthesize the core of our work. And we just focus much on really going into grandiose statements, when sometimes what we need is, can you put this in 240, can you put this in 280 characters? And sometimes the ability to put it in 280 characters or elevator speech is what shows that you really are owning your scholarship, as opposed to just, as you said, citing everybody and everybody else. Because I mean, yeah, we have to cite everybody and everybody else, but there comes a point that we have to take a stand, and we have to take a political stand, as you both of you had pointed out. And okay, what is my stance in relation to the topic and the field of study that I'm exploring?
I think so, absolutely. I want to add to that, and again, I'm gonna call out my dissertation chair. It's been so many years, Walter, and yet you're still with me.
Well, it's gonna be for a while.
I know. What are you gonna do?
Love it.
You know, but one of the things that I remember, oh God, this is of course now almost 7 years ago, but he told us, that was, as a class, it was super helpful, was this idea of imagine the smartest person you know that is slightly hungover, and that's your audience, right? In other words, somebody who's intelligent enough to handle it, whatever it is you're talking about, but just really might need a little bit more explanation than normal, hence the hungover part. And so I think, or maybe they're just distressed from something else, if you don't want to have that part of it, okay? But the point is that I think it's really significant to think about who's the audience you want, but still spelling stuff out. I think one of the things that happens is, I think we all do this regardless of where you're at as a student or as a professional, jumping through ideas and assuming that we're all following the same path that you have decided to follow. And so being really clear about what were the decisions you made, how did you make them, and then how do they relate, right? So that clarity and really spelling it out becomes so significant. And so if you think about the necessity for explaining it to a 7-year-old, as Raúl was saying, I have an 8-year-old at home. I can tell you that if I were to try to explain to her some of the work that I'm doing, I wouldn't use all the words and ideas. And at the same time, you need to have those in the literature review. So those clarifying statements and questions afterwards become also just as important, right? So I think what I'm hearing the three of us saying to you is this idea of making sure that you are clear, and then deciding for what audience you want to be clear for, which is, by the way, also a political statement. Because I've read some people who seem rather obtuse in their work. They've made the decision to do that, right? In their language, in the way they write. Now, sometimes it's the field, because I can tell you that some fields of education sound a lot different than educational philosophy fields and things like that, okay? So sometimes you're writing the language and the tone and tenor of the field, but also understanding that when you make the choice to write in a particular way, that's you're choosing your audience, which is in itself a political act.
And that you shouldn't lose yourself in the discourse.
Yes.
That you should use the discourse as a way to amplify yourself. I mean, because sometimes you hear all the time and that people start using this overly elevated language for no other reason than to sound quote unquote scholarly. And I'm still trying to figure out what on earth that means. Sometimes I have grad students writing to me like, yeah, it's like I'm trying to organize my article, but I don't know how to sound like a grad student. I'm like, I don't know, lost and confused, because that's what I sounded like when I was a doctoral student. I was like lost and confused, and clueless half the time. If that's what you want to go for, I think you're already there. But what does it mean to sound like a scholar? I mean, there's a question like, what does it mean to sound like a scholar? I mean, I don't even know what that means sometimes. I just think it's talking about the things that matter to me in a way that I can show the world exactly what I'm doing. You can kind of adjust the vocabulary to wherever I'm presenting, but not losing yourselves in the act. And I think that's very important in the process of organizing your writing, not losing yourselves in the process. I'm gonna make right now open room for students have questions. So if any of you have questions right now, this is a good time to start asking. Ask away. Just give people a couple of seconds to collect their thoughts together.
I just want to say I love that you said that as the professor sitting in front of the room. And there's a way that as a grad student, as an undergrad, that I wasn't even able to name the power differential in the space and what it would have meant for me to hear that, particularly as a Black woman in many and all very white spaces, to have heard that my unique voice, perspective, cusp, intersections was not only important, but valued in the academy. So I deeply resonate and appreciate naming that. And that it's that very voice that will expand our understanding. Like it's what we actually need. That's the research, is open spaces for all of our voices. So thank you.
So girls, any questions you have for our guests? Don't be shy. This is a good time to ask a question. And any question you ask is going to be very welcome, because you got lots of good ideas in your brain. So go for it. I see Natalia open the microphone. Natalia.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Natalia.
I just wanted to ask you if you can give us, like, I don't know, like a checklist on how to review our literature review, like to say this is ready for my advisor, my supervisor to read it. And I know that all the elements that I have here are the ones that I need to have in my lit review. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to jump in, Boni, or do you?
No, I was going to actually tell you, because you have that resource that you regularly work with, and I know that they do talk a little bit about that
They
in
do.
particular text. So I'm just gonna...
And I really like that book, so I would highly recommend it, because she has they have some really practical ways of making sure that you're including a broad perspective in your literature review, and that you're coming to that piece. I would say I don't have a checklist per se, but these are some of the pieces of advice that I offer my students as they're nearing the end of chapter 2, is to make sure that you've come to that purpose statement, right? And that in your view, that it makes sense, the story that you've told to help us get to that purpose statement. Right? And that purpose statement includes the actual question, your big research question, or elements of it, right? So that's one thing. Make sure that you've included enough data, literature, such that we come to that purpose statement and it makes sense. The other thing that I would say is, if you're wondering whether or not you've covered all of the substantive areas, is that I have my students do a reverse outline. Right? I write in stages. I love that. And so go back and outline your literature review, right? And see how those big headings and little headings and articles are actually connecting together, so that you're doing a backwards map, if you will, of what you've written. And that can sometimes help you, since you've been so in it, to take a macro look. Like you were saying earlier, Boni, the forest for the trees, although you're using a different example, to see, okay, now how does the forest look, right? I've been in the trees for so long. Let me take a step back and look how these big substantive areas are connecting. Is there a substantive area that I'm missing? And so you may also have folks who aren't willing to read that whole lit review, but who will go back and actually look at an outline and say, oh, what about this area? You know, and so that's a strategy that I've had students use to at that very end piece. I hope that helps.
That's those are amazing ideas, actually. You know, one of the things that I always tell my students to do is actually to go back, set some time aside and read the entire thing from start to finish out loud, not quietly in your head, actually read it out loud, because you do catch more things than you would imagine as you're using your actual voice rather than your reading voice. Those are, you know, related, but not always the same thing. And so I think that that becomes an important thing. One of the other things that I ask my students to do is to make a list of whose voices that they included in the literature review. So literally just, I cited these people, not just the references. I mean, you can have your reference list, but just, again, write it out somewhere. And then just think to yourself, like, is this balanced in the way that I intended for it to be balanced? If that was your intention, right? That's not everybody's project. But I think for me, it's important to go back and say, all right, well, these are the ideas. And so again, write out the ideas, main points. This is sort of like a reverse outline maybe, but main ideas and main points, and then the voices that were included. And then just start drawing lines between those things. Are they as related as you think? Are they as balanced as you think? Things like that become significant because at the end of it, I think you want to make sure, or I always want to make sure that I did what I thought I did. And so going back and doing that kind of work becomes important. So I always say to them, if they can go back and is the argument what I think the argument is, right? So these are my main points. Did I make them? Yes. Who said these main points, or what ideas did I bring to be able to discuss these points? And then when you go back and then read all of those things out loud, does it also make sense in another set of voices as well? But I always say, if you have a writing buddy, also, again, lean on your colleagues. You're saying before you hand it to your advisor, I believe was the last part of that question, right? And so I really would encourage you to find somebody to trade drafts with, or some buddies, right? And not necessarily, it doesn't always have to be the people you're working with. You know, as you continue developing these ideas, I mean, I just had an undergraduate student from Harvard contact me about her thesis to say, all right, well, I'm thinking about doing this work. Can you help me? Just because we generally, you think of us maybe sometimes as generally working or welcoming anyway doc students to do this kind of work. I know a lot of people who are fairly accessible and sometimes sending what you think is a strong draft or at least bouncing some ideas off of other people that might be maybe some of the figures that you're reading about in your literature review, right? There's nothing wrong with seeking those people out. You are building, part of what you're doing here is you are building an understanding of the field, but hopefully you're also building a community. And in the building of the community and the way that you would like it to function, go find those people and ask them, hey, I read your work. I'm really struck by your ideas. These are the things that I'm thinking, you know, and just getting them to see if they'll respond. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. But I think it's worth saying to yourself, okay, well, these are my colleagues, my home colleagues. I can trade papers with this person from my institution, but maybe find other people outside your institution and say, hey, these are the ideas. They might not have time to read a 20-page paper, but at least, you know, thinking through what they do, what they might be willing to give you in terms of time to think with you about ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, please go ahead.
Go
I would say, particularly as a woman of color, Boni, I really appreciate thinking about representation in my citation list. Like, who am I citing, towards what end, and what that means. So yeah, I really appreciate that point greatly.
Yeah. So yeah, that I mean, and I just wanted to add a couple of things there. Number one, yes, I completely agree that you need to make sure you should. I mean, I like to say that. I mean, sometimes you have to write by yourself. It doesn't mean you have to write alone. Um, and you can run ideas by other people. I in my own writing sometimes. I mean, usually sometimes I just run ideas by my even by my researchers because I'm gonna okay, look at this draft and just tell me, does this make sense? And does this make sense mean doesn't necessarily mean uh, is this something coherent, but it's something that that students or people who are just kind of starting the journey can understand, because sometimes we write things in a language that only the Illuminati of the field seem to grasp. And then we forget that there are sometimes people reading our articles that are first year students or undergrads who are practitioners, and they still want to get our papers and get some ideas from that. So always like keep that in mind that your text should be comprehensible enough to different audiences. Um, in the context of this class, I mean, everybody, I mean, the class operates right now on we use a space on Google Drive, so everybody has access to everybody's folders. So the invitation is definitely follow Boni's idea that you can ask one of your classmates, can you take a look at this draft? Can you take a look at this, tell me what you think? But then there is a third part of that question. It's the send it to your advisor. And here is where I, again, as the instructor and as someone who has master's and doctoral students, send something when you have something. That is the best, because the question is, when should I send it? Because that becomes problematic. And I have seen a lot of grad students, and the grad students who are listening to this webinar, listen to this part. I'm going to say it slowly so everybody gets it. It's funny on YouTube. Send your advisor something when you have something. Don't wait until you have the whole thing, because that's maybe too late. If you already have the beginnings of a lit review, send that so you can get initial feedback. Because sometimes students are like, oh, I'm just waiting to send a perfect draft or a really good draft. Like, no, you're not going to have a good draft. That's why it's called draft. Send what you have, no matter how bad it is, so we can give you feedback and you can make it better. But if you wait too long to send your advisor a draft, you're actually losing time, losing precious time you need to get your research moving forward. So, I mean, for the students here and the students who are listening, some of my students who are listening, if you haven't sent your advisor a draft of what you have right now, this weekend is a good time to start doing it. I have something, because the more you send us, the more feedback we can provide. Because I mean, we don't, and usually when we are directing people's terminal work, we know that the first drafts are work in progress. We keep it real. We know you're not going to have something publishable until it's time to defend. We keep it real.
I totally support that. And then also negotiating with your advisor, like, are they willing to read that draft? Do they want something else? Do they want something anyway? But I would say the idea, send when you have, and then negotiating it. The other thing that does is it gets you out of your head. It gets you out of that paralysis of, oh my gosh, I'm never going to have that perfect thing, so I'm not going to send it in. And then I'm going to avoid them when they email me, and just send it. Get it out of your head, get it out of your computer, and then go do something else and come back to it. That's the healthy thing to do, right?
Absolutely. Any other questions from anybody else? This is a good time. Don't save those questions for later, because later everybody's going home.
Yeah, we're already home.
Well, I'm going for a walk with the dogs. Oh my God, look at just give me a break. Going home or staying home these are crazy times, Boni.
Just reminding you what's going on. All right.
These are crazy times, Boni. These are crazy times. But yeah, you get so. But actually, there's one thing we discussed, and I want to bring that because I want to hear your thoughts. I mean, there's always the question of always sometimes when it comes to the relationship with the conceptual framework, the lit review. There is always that chicken and the egg question that sometimes students ask. What should go first? Should I start with the conceptual framework, start with the lit review? What is your approach when it comes to the connection between those two?
Well, so I'm an ethnographer by trade, and so I think a lot of the work that I do is coming to it with some sort of an idea as to what you're thinking about, and then adjusting that as the study goes on. And the study isn't always with the participants, right? Sometimes the study is engaging with the literature review as well. So I think that the chicken and the egg is a little bit of a misnomer because it'll force you to choose one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
When I think that part of what we do as qualitative researchers should anyway be a lot of reflection, right? So as we're trying to practice reflexivity in our work as teachers, you know, as researchers, I don't necessarily want to say, okay, well, do this first or do that first. I think it's always going to be emergent. And so as we're thinking within emergent terms, maybe something comes along that makes you change completely what you're thinking about. So part of it is an openness to change. I think students sometimes think they really get it in their head, oh, I wanted to do this. Well, that might not work, especially once you start involving other human bodies. See all of qualitative research, right? And so, well, you might have said, okay, well, this is the thing I want to do. Even sometimes you start to get into literature and you think like, okay, wait a minute, that's maybe not, or maybe you have to tweak it. And so I think it's a both and, right? You start thinking about both, you start doing the literature review with this idea in mind. Obviously, you're not just going to randomly surf the web or there's no random searching. There's no randomly searching the web. Let's be honest about that, right? You always go with some sort of an intention, right? So there's always for me this question of intention and attention. And so with what intent are you trying to do this research and how are you paying attention to what's out there? And then how does your attention allow you to adjust what you're doing, right? Again, like it's a cycle. And so you have to be willing to engage in that cycle. And then as a part of that, be okay with change and things like that too.
Wow, that's so beautifully put. I do agree. I mean, I think about it as an iterative process, right? The relationship between those pieces, and that the emergent information that evolves through it, right? And I, taking a step back, this is a question that I often equate to as a clinical psychologist. My students are training to be licensed clinical psychologists and therapists. And so the question is, what's my theoretical orientation? Am I cognitive behavioral? Am I psychodynamic? Am I existential? Am I systemic? And then if I am, then what does that mean? What does that look like, right? And how do I stick to it? And in many ways, we as a program force them to do that too. But I have a very similar conversation with them, right? For me, understanding the elements that have made up my theoretical orientation have come with meditation, understanding my cultural grounding, understanding what resonates with my spirit and my soul, and what I see before me and what doesn't. And so for me, being a systemic therapist, again, goes back to being Haitian, right? Being a community psychologist, like when you meet a Haitian person, you ask them how they're doing and you immediately ask how their people are doing. Because when you understand how their people are doing, you also understand how they're doing. And so I come by being a systemic therapist culturally, emotionally, in a grounded way. And so, but then that looks different ways in the work that I do, right? In my actual practice. And so then I've learned elements of what it means to be a systemic therapist, but knowing that that's part of my spirit. Other pieces have come into play and I don't force them out, but I allow them to influence. I allow psychodynamic influences. I allow CB2 influences. I allow these other places in a dynamic way that's not fearful, but based on knowing that ultimately my openness to these other perspectives will help me stay grounded in the way that I view. And so I think about, all of these these philosophical pieces in a similar way, sitting really quiet with like, what do I believe about this question and how I'm choosing to ask this question? And how is that grounded? And so what's that position? What are other positions that can and have influenced it? And how can I allow it to be a dynamic process with the work that I see before me. Yeah? I hope that helps to kind of.
Well, it does, but then I think the question actually, and you're right, the question was more in the sense of once you put it on the paper. Because I understand, I mean, like, for me, yeah, the cyclical, but sometimes there are people who say, no, first you write the conceptual framework and then you put the lit review. So people say you start with the review and then you go with the conceptual framework. I mean, in terms of just put it on the actual piece of paper. Do you have a particular preference? And when you write, when talking about the actual writing itself?
That's a great question. And I guess then as I think about that parallel, for me, settling into a conceptual framework that has been dynamic in process, and for me, that's the lens. And so I offering the lens and then getting into it makes sense for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, when I think about a lit review. So when I sit with a client, I will share that I come from a systemic perspective and a trauma-focused perspective, and then I want to hear what they're saying. And then elements of these other psychodynamic or CBT might come up, but when I sit with them, I share my perspective, but it's all in light of what they bring to the table too, right? But that, I guess, would come secondary. Like, I set the frame. So for me, I guess offering the conceptual framework is setting the frame, but the pre-work is really dynamic. And I'm open to expanding that frame too.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I do come to the table with ideas, and then that's an adjustment. So I like what Cynthia's saying about this idea of setting the frame. I think it very much is like, even in a more literal sense, actually setting a table, understanding that how I decide to rearrange things or to arrange things is going to maybe change. But I do know that there are certain things that I'm going to have at least to start with there. And that it might be rearranged, it might be taken away, it might be something else might be put in its place. But I'm going to start with some basic premise or idea.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what are you really looking for, right?
Yeah. I would agree. I hear your question, Raúl. And I think part of me is hesitant because I really think it's so important to stay open. But once you start writing, I think it's helpful to have a lens, to offer that lens to your reader, and to offer a clarified lens, because I think it also speaks to my position, your position, our position, and then moving forward from there.
No, thank you.
I think too, Cynthia, I want to pick up on what you said there, the idea of once you start writing, and this idea of words on page. Thank you to my past associate, Dean Rob Helfenbein, for that gem, which is, I think I have this, okay, words on page. Put them, just start writing. At some point, you have to start writing. And for me, it's met with like a Muppet-like scream of terror and anxiety of, I think I have it, oh, I don't have it. Let me just back up and say this, okay? I'm sitting here at the end of my third year as a professor who graduated and didn't become a professor immediately, right? So like, I've been doing this for a minute. And at the end of it, I still have moments of doubt. I still have moments of anxiety where I'm sitting there and thinking to myself, okay, what if I get it all wrong? Or what if I really missed the boat, whatever the boat is? I'm sitting here on a train, and I'm screwed, basically. I'm in trouble here. And I don't know that those feelings ever really truly go away. And I don't want them to, because those are the feelings for me that drive me toward doing things in a particularly careful way. I work with marginalized populations. I don't want to feel like I have it all down and like I know everything.
Yes.
That doubt drives me toward reflection in a way that becomes significant. But at some point, you have to put the words on the page. So whatever it is, whether you meditate or whether you scream like a Muppet who's terrified of things, or whether you go take your dogs for a walk, or whatever it is that you do those things, okay? Mm-hmm. And then come back to it. And then put the words on the page. Because after all of your reading, when you hit that saturation point, at some point that you just have to do that work. So do it, right? And then move forward and see how it goes.
All right, so we have a question. Hold on, yes, but we have a question. Sarah has been patiently waiting for her turn. So I'm gonna open the microphone for her. Sarah, go for it. Wait. What? Hold on. Sarah, let's unmute your microphone because.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm here. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So my question is, when we start developing a research proposal, there are different concepts that we have to state, right? So on average, how many articles or books it is recommended to use per concept? I mean, is there a limit, or are we free to use as much literature as we desire? Thank you.
I am sitting this one out, by the way.
What'd you say, Raúl?
I said that I am sitting this one out.
I was actually going to put it right back on you and say, well,
No, I'm sitting this one.
talk
I'll
to
give
you.
the annoying answer that I give my students, much to their consternation and their fist shaking in the air. I would say enough. And you know it's enough, you know, from a qualitative perspective when you've, as Boni alluded to earlier, when you're researching saturation in a particular area, right? First of all, you want to make sure that you're capturing you know, the seminal articles in your field, the seminal argument in that particular area, right? So you want to make sure that you're doing that. And then you want to make sure that in that small little chunk part of the literature review outline that you're painting a broad enough picture and that you're getting to saturation, right? And that you're seeing similar ideas and themes. So to borrow that qualitative piece. And then you know, the question of enough. I would say also paying attention to, you know, the chrono system, right? Like how are the articles that you've chosen situated in time and space, in the history of your field, in the currency of your field? Like how is that all related and represented? So those are some of the pieces that I would pay attention to: saturation, the chrono system, historicity, currency, how they're connected, the broadness, and you know, making sure that it's substantial and that that piece helps you to answer or come up with your research question. I would say also, like in qualitative research, right, that you have to think about how each, like I said it earlier, like each article is knocking on the door trying to make it into your lit review. And it has to make a really good argument about why it deserves to be in there. And so you have to squeeze out that piece. Can I say one more thing that I almost forgot? And this is a shout out to my great friend and colleague, Dr. Rachel Pizor, who is a phenom when it comes to lit reviews. And I am not on any of these, and I should be, but Mendeley and some of those other, you all know those so much better than I do. But what she has her students do in the annotated bibliography is that she has them do the outline and come up with articles under each, you know, piece of the outline. But then what she does is have them, and she says it in such a beautiful way, you want to squeeze everything out of that article that first read. And not that you don't come back and read it, but you want to go back and you provide a summary that helps you understand why you read that article, why and how it would make it into your literature review, the you know, salient points, and maybe some recommendations. So when you go back to your little chunk about that article, it's all there. And then you want to write a summary that you can imagine taking out and plopping right into your lit review, right? So do the work at the beginning, do that hard work at the beginning, and then it also informs how you're seeing all of these pieces flow together. So I really love the idea of physical articles. You know, I'm old school, writing on. But you know what? The idea of doing that on Mendeley or one of these like wonderful platforms, and I've seen how her students do it, is life-changing. Life-changing. Like you literally pick up the piece from your Mendeley and put it in your lit review. And it's already in the outline format. I mean, essentially, you're writing as you go along. So that was related to your question somehow in my mind, Sarah, I hope.
So yeah, I don't know that there's a whole lot to add to that because you did it so well, Cynthia. I think the only thing that I might say, there's the comment that says there's no magical number to your lit review here in the comment section that I'm reading. And that's absolutely true. So if you're looking for I could make up a number that would be a lie. Because here's the reality is that some fields are smaller than others, right? So to say, okay, well, you have to have 40 articles. Well, what if it's an incredibly or a newer concept, right? And then you don't have 40 strong articles to cite. It's really one of those things that I want you to be able to tell me, to know, first of all, to know that you don't know all the literature, right? Please give yourself a break. You cannot learn everything. And so once you just hit that moment where you can just say that enough is enough. You know, I once had a close friend tell me that they knew that they were done with things when they could look at somebody and say like, no, I'm done. And I remember at the time being in the middle of something and looking and saying like, I'm done. And he just said, no, it's not a question, it's a statement. And until you can turn that from a question of, am I done with this, to a statement, no, I'm done. I'm finished. I know what I know. And here's how I've decided to put that together. So it's a feeling. And I know that that's frustrating because there's not a number, it's completely affective. And that can be really difficult for somebody who's looking to be able to say, okay, I've now checked the box, right? I know, and therefore, but that doesn't exist. It's completely affective. And it's completely about your ability to make the argument that you're done. And so you'll know it, you'll feel it when you get there. I wish that there was a better answer.
Well, let me jump in because I wasn't going to fully sit this one out. I was just clowning the two of you. No, but there are, I mean, yeah, I agree because the quote that Zadie just put, it's attributed to a guy called Dr. Berry, and I'm Dr. Berry, so there you go. I mean, in one of the things I always tell the students when we teach the qualitative methods classes, no, there are no magic numbers. And you want a number, I'll just give you, I'll tell you the answer is 42. I mean, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I'll just say, oh, the answer is 42. You want a number, I'll give you one, 42. That's the answer. That's the answer to the universe and the meaning of everything. But there are things that we do know. And just as I cannot tell you there is such a, I mean, I don't know if there's such a thing as too many articles. I do know there's such a thing as too few. And we can start with that. There is such a thing as too few articles. If you come out with a lit review and you say, for example, you surveyed and you only found like 3 articles in the last 2 years, I'm gonna be, okay, first of all, that is not enough. It's not enough because you're not surveying the field long, you're not going into what Cynthia was saying, this historicity. You need to survey for a period of time that I would say, I mean, I was saying in the first part, I mean, 10 years is not a bad number to play with. Survey the past 10 years in general is not a bad number. Also, you also have to consider the topic. And I always say, for example, when you took, for example, people who study social media, you're not going to find literature before a certain year. So I always say, for example, the case of Facebook, you're not going to find literature about Facebook before 2006. And it's only because, well, no, you're not going to find an article on Facebook in 2003. That doesn't exist because, well, Facebook started in 2004. Give people 2 or 3 years to start developing their studies and writing the dissertations on the topic, 2007. So I can say, oh, based on that, I'm going to say, well, I'm more reasonable, so I can find a critical mass of literature, say 2010 onwards. So you cannot play with that, like the topic itself, where you, for example, you're looking at the work of author X or Y. You can start a question, does this author write in English? No, he's an author that had to be translated. Okay, when was the original work? When was the first translation? And you can say, well, give yourself 5 to 10 years for people to read the translation, to dissect it, to develop the studies, and then you can kind of start playing with that. So like that, so you can say, well, I can create timelines. And from those timelines, I can say, well, I found X articles in Y period of time. It's a more reasonable answer. So you can say, for example, yeah, I found 20 articles in the last 10 years. Okay, I would say, well, someone who has, I mean, if you tell me that you did that, that's not a magical number, but I would say, oh, that's gonna be a sensible literature review that I can see that you really took the time to explore. Because again, the amount of articles that you review in the end it's just the tip of the iceberg versus the amount of things, just versus the amount of titles that you had to survey. Because even looking at the titles is like, can be 20 or 30 times more than whatever you end up with a review. But so there is such a thing as very few articles. And I mean, sometimes you get reviewed, and I can see that you only cited 3 papers. I'm gonna raise a lot of questions because I'm saying, oh, you didn't read enough. If I see a lot of articles, if I see an exorbitant number, then I'm gonna start thinking, well, you didn't read it thoroughly enough. You didn't read enough in the sense of thoroughly enough. So it's always finding, I was like, survey the literature, I mean, determine, and I think the first key is determine a timeline. Determine a timeline based on the topic, based on your personal experience. I mean, you can come up with deciding factors and you decide on a timeline, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whichever is reasonable within the scope of the problem. You can say, for example, I want to look at, let's say, hypothetical. I'm gonna say 10 years because I've been in my school for 10 years. And since the subject is my school, I want to look at literature around the time I have been in school to help me make a better sense of the problem. That, for example, if you put in a lit review, it's a very good explanation. Oh yeah, 10 years because I have been in the school for 10 years. Okay, if I read that in a lit review, I would say, that's a very reasonable rationale for the choice of article and for that timeline. You cannot cover that, especially in slides like this. If you're doing now, because again, the timeline depends on the field. Like Paulina, my wife, she has done some work in historiography. If you're gonna do historiography, you have to cover, I mean, anything below 50 years, I think it's gonna be like, okay, that's a very small number. It has to be about 50. But because the work you do in that sense is archival, you spend a lot of time digging through archives, you have to go and dig into 50, 75, 100 years. It's a different field. So all those factors come into play, and you just make decision. And if you're not sure, then you just run questions by people who know a little bit of a thing or two of research. And you can, and then that's as your instructor, that's what I'm here for. You can say, hey, Raúl, this is what I'm thinking of doing with this. And I would say, well, yeah, or maybe you need to read more. And then and then we can go into the specifics, because there are some things, and this is important when it comes to qualitative research, there are some things that it's difficult to make blanket statements. And there comes a point that, put words on paper so I can give you specific advice for your particular situation. I wonder if there is one last question from.
I'm going to add, Raúl, I just put in the comments this picture of the horse that we've seen like floating around in memes.
Yes.
Because as you were talking, it actually reminded me very much of this. Like, you want to be more like the hindquarters of the horse. And I tell my students, right, don't be like the front leg, which is like terribly underdeveloped. And to some degree, when you've done that, right? Because you haven't immersed yourself enough in the literature. And so understand that what you're aspiring to and what your product is, and then own that in some way, shape, or form. But I really do like this horse because it is, for me, a pretty good indication of what we think we're doing and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen the picture of the horse, and I'm going to say, you have another one. I'll send you to you later. That it's a stop sign painted on the floor on the street. I'll look at it and I'll share it with you later. So, any final question from any of the students? Give them a second to think. No, I don't see any hands raised. Natalia, are you going to ask? Because I see your microphone is on.
Yes, please.
Oh, go for it, by all means.
Okay. When we were talking about the timeline, you said like, because I had a first approach on research, and it was like, you have to find literature review, but recent, like the latest works on your field or on your research question. But I couldn't find any. That was something that we were discussing back then. And it was hard to find like recent literature about that, and for my advisor that wasn't okay. So I don't know to what extent is that okay to do it, or is there something that you say, no, that's too old, or that's something like that?
That's a really great question. Who was that? Was that?
Natalia.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. First, I would make sure that within that time span, that there wasn't the within your field, right? And then I would, you know, as we talked about earlier, look at tangential fields and related fields and see what other conversations were happening. And if there were, exploring what those conversations were and how they're influencing the way that you're thinking about your field. But the other piece that I would do, if in fact in your field, in that substantive field, there hasn't been work recently, I would start to explore why that is the case, right? One, I would talk to scholars in the field. I would do more reading about what's happened in the past, the recommendations, you know, say, you know, folks stopped writing articles about this in 2000. What were the recommendations? What happened? Why did it fall off? And for you, part of your investigation, and that's the other thing, as, you know, folks doing a literature review, you're an investigator. You're doing a case study, essentially. You want to fill in that blank. You want the reader to understand, why was the last article on this written in 2000? Are folks calling this something else? Did we go in a different direction? Why did we go in a different direction? You know, I'm just making stuff up, but why did that happen? And then why is your wanting to bring it up, one, pertinent, and also really important at this point? You have to make a case for that as well. So I would want, if I was the reader, I'd want to understand, well, what happened? And what are you going to do about it? Why are you going to tell me why it's important again now?
I think the only thing that I would add to that, the one thing, Natalia, that I think I heard you saying was that there's a concern about articles being too old. I work in a field where, for me, I'm sometimes using historical texts and I'm putting them next to contemporary scholars. It depends on why you're bringing that up, though, right? So you know, I can use some of those texts to speak really clearly about some of the ways that the field itself is still in certain sets of iterations, right? And so I think it becomes important to say, I don't know that texts are too old. Sometimes I think we can't make an argument for their inclusion, though. If they're not relevant, I don't even want to say relevant. I want to say if they're not resonant to what you're doing, right? Relevant is a consensus perspective. I don't necessarily want to be a part of that project for this anyway. And so I think, you know, you're going to have to ask that question with those historical texts. And what I really loved about something Cynthia said was maybe things aren't cited that way because the field has moved in a different way and it's under a different name. And sometimes things are named retroactively. And so let's think about queer theory, for example, that people were doing queer theory well before it was called queer theory in 1991, right? Like, so a lot of times then it looks like, well, maybe those lines aren't the same anymore. Well, they are, but they're just, a field has been formed around those things. And so this is when, as Cynthia again said, this idea of being an investigator becomes important because you're trying to figure out how the field has moved and how it was territorialized, deterritorialized, reterritorialized, all of those things. And so when you think about those movements, remember that it's not static. Fields are never static. And so you can't think about them necessarily as something you can just put your finger on, like, okay, and now I know this. Understanding that there are all of these moving parts, because even the historical texts are up to interpretation, right? And so even though somebody said something, and if you, let's say you can't go back to Freire and read the source text, you're relying on somebody else's interpretation, which, going back to the conversation earlier, being able to read them sometimes in those home languages becomes so significant because then you can give your own interpretation of those things, or you can lay your interpretation next to somebody's interpretation. So remembering that the field has this degree of fluidity to it, than it being this monolithic thing that exists or existed, because it's going to be shaped around interpretations and ideas and reads of those works. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, if you're not seeing something that happened right now, maybe that tangential field that can answer that question, but maybe that tangential field is actually just the way that the field moved. And so thinking about what that might mean as well.
I just wanted to add one thing. I wanted to add one thing, and then I want to read a question that somebody left in the chat and in the YouTube channel. That idea of recent, it's an idea we always have to take with a grain of salt. Yes, it's important to survey the literature of the past few years. and it's important to really make sure that you are, whether you're doing a little review or you're teaching a course, that you have recent literature. But that does not preclude going all the way back and looking at certain literature from certain years. Because sometimes there are articles that you are going to find way back that are the ones that are going to make sense. And I remember an example when I was writing a small primer on the notion of first 10, and I was like started looking for articles, and the first article I found that actually explained it was an article from 1945. The article by Abel, the operation called verse 10, I think it's called. It is 1945. And I'm like, okay, 1945, that's a long time ago, but that was the only article I found that actually really explained it. The other, I mean, from then on, apparently people just took the concept for granted and nobody talked about it anymore. So it's always relative. Now, in the how recent you should go or how far back you should go, the field itself is going to tell you. And if you find that the recent searches are not yielding any results, that means either it's a very new topic that is just developing, maybe the literature is just emerging, and maybe in a case like that, what you have to do is not just look at the journal articles, but maybe start digging through dissertations, because maybe that's where the topic is beginning, because that is a possibility. The topic is really, really recent. What you're gonna find the topic is gonna breeding is gonna be, it's not gonna be in the peer-reviewed articles. It's gonna be in dissertations, in conference papers. So that's a tip. But if that is option one, option two is, okay, I need to start moving back the clock, and then interrogate why this topic. I mean, why there are topics that people stop writing in the first place. Was it because the topic because we just cross the bridge on the topic? Is it because the topic run out of fashion, stop being the flavor of the month? Interrogate why. I mean, when you have a situation like that, interrogate the field. As a scholar, that's your right to interrogate the field. And also there, because I'm going to read the question. So it's a question from one of the students I had last year in the research class. I sent them the link and I said, you're welcome to join. And one of them, Hernan, just wrote a question. I'm going to read the whole text. First of all, I would like to thank you both, Cynthia and Boni, for sharing your knowledge and research experience with us. Regarding the lit review, should I go from a local to a world context or vice versa?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question. And, you know, again, I would go, well, one, what do we mean by local and global, right? There's so many different ways to think about this. I can go down a whole, you know, I was telling Raúl earlier that I've been troubling the idea of decolonization and colonization in general and what that means. And so are we talking geopolitically? Are we talking theoretically? Are we talking internally, externally? What do we mean by local and global? How do those feel relevant? And I like your word, more than relevant, Boni. How do those feel resonant to the questions that we're asking? And how does that, is there a way that that's figure ground? And which is figure, which is ground? How have we come to decide that? How we're making sense of that? I think all of those elements would help to get to my firm answer of yes to all of it, to muddy the waters a little bit more.
Right. And I love the fact, Cynthia, that you are troubling what is global and what is local. So I think, and this is not an answer, I know, but I think a huge part of it is, what does your question call for? So you're going to have to go back to your framework and go back to some of the things you were considering. I think there's always something to be said for local and then less local ideas, and then the tacking back and forth between those things. And so when I write, one of the first things for a literature review, let's base it in that first. What I try and do is think, okay, well, what is the field that I'm specifically trying to write for here? And I'm going to start locally, quote unquote, to that field. And then I might go a little less locally or more globally to tangential fields, and then think about what are the relationships between those things. Because I think it's really, for me, and I've seen people do it the opposite way, right? One of the more beautiful metaphors that I've heard from this is one of my colleagues who likes to think of it as a tornado, right? And she likes to really attend to all this stuff that's up here, and then she likes to narrow it down. And I think that's certainly something you can do. I like to really think about, like, what is this one tree that's in front of me, and how can I really detail it, and really think about all of the pieces and parts of that, and then think about how that relates to other things, right? So I kind of move outward from that when I'm doing a literature review, but that's a really personal choice, right? So I don't know that it's the right answer. It really depends on you. Like, she likes to read really broadly and say, like, oh my gosh, there's all this thing swirling around, and then how do I want to pull all that down into one thing? I like to say, like, well, what is the one thing, and then how does it relate to all of these things out here? And so I think it's something, it's a voice that you're going to develop as a scholar. And so I would play with both. I mean, I've tried the opposite way. It doesn't necessarily always work for me. You know, it might work perfectly well for other people. So I think a huge part of it is going to be you adjusting to whatever your scholarly voice and your scholarly needs are for developing a strong literature review. There's no right answer to this from my perspective. It's just really working through the process and honoring it as a process.
Wow, amazing. Okay, we're just about to take this to an end because it's almost 2:00, so the class period is over. But I mean, this webinar is part of an ongoing series we have on YouTube. It's called LSLP in Session. I mean, that we have guests, and we have several of them already coming to talk to our research methods class. And I always like to end with one question because I think it's important for the crowd to listen to that. And I always like to ask the guests to give, because again, the target audience for these are teachers who are just beginning to do research, or undergrads who are just starting to, I mean, people who are just beginning the journey that we have been walking for several years already. So I always like to get, what advice you would give to these young researchers who are right here in the webinar and listening to the video and on the YouTube channel? What advice you would give them in terms of the journey of becoming a qualitative researcher?
Cynthia, do you want to go, or do you want me to? Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that's actually the hardest question, Raúl, that we've been posed. I think for me, as a qualitative researcher, I would give the advice. It's a maybe two-pronged piece of advice, but it's based in a question of vulnerability. And the first is to be okay with being vulnerable. You know, Ruth Baer's The Vulnerable Observer is still by far one of my favorite pieces of work. A lot of the work that I do has required a particular amount of just openness and vulnerability on my part. That wasn't always easy because that's not the way that I operated in the world. And so I think particularly as marginalized people, we put on these shields, and then suddenly as researchers, to do some of the work that we do, we take those shields off when we're with participants and things like that. So I would say that learning how, or if you can be vulnerable, what that looks like. I'm not saying that you have to be vulnerable to be a good researcher. I want to be really clear about that. But I think that this work does require some degree of that, right? And so thinking through what that means for you. And then the second piece of advice would be self-care on top of that. So whatever your self-care is, really doing that and allowing yourself to disengage from the research part. Stop reading, stop having interviews, just disengage, and then take care of yourself as well. Because I think part of vulnerability means allowing ourselves to be vulnerable enough to take care of ourselves. And so I think that becomes a significant part of the work. The rest will follow, right? If I were to add to that, I would add the last bit of don't get too comfortable. I tell this to my pre-service teachers. I always tell them, if you feel like you know everything, you should probably quit, it's time to quit, because you shouldn't ever know anything, whether it's about teaching or researching. So to be open, right? But even that requires a degree of vulnerability as well.
Thank you. That was really powerful and resonates with so much of what I would say. I think, the first thing that I would say is, trust thyself. I think it's Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, trust thyself, let every heart vibrate to that iron string. And back to one of our earlier statements, you bring a unique voice, multiplicity of perspectives to the table. And all of those pieces, all of your history, all of what you sit with are central to the way that you step into asking questions, and to trust that and stay grounded in that and to stay firm in that. To echo part of what Boni said is then to allow yourself to be on shaky ground, right? I think about, Hegel, thesis, you're strong. Find those antitheses. Find the things that offer you the shaky space so you can come to a synthesis that actually, is part of an alchemy, something that's changed. So allow yourself to be in those shaky places. If you are not at a shaky place at some point in your lit review, if you're not at a place where you're like, what am I doing? What am I asking? Am I asking the right questions? Then there's a way that, as Boni said, that you might be missing part of what's going on. You might be missing a voice or a perspective. I think one of the biggest pieces, so trust yourself, right? Trust what you bring to the table and trust that you can move through those shaky places, right? I'm very Socratic in my approach, and I love all of my students. And one of the things that I tell them, they'll ask in dissertation interviews, who works well with you? And I said, I don't give answers. And one of the things, at some point, all of my dissertation students, I'm sure, are shaking their fists at me because they come and they're like, Dr. Langtiw, just tell us the answer, and I won't. And it's not because I don't have it, and it's not because I don't want to, it's because I trust you. And I trust your ability to move through the shaky place and find the answer that if you allow yourself to get silent, that you will hear and that will emerge. So trust yourself. I would say the other piece, I have this whole soapbox lecture on rigor in qualitative research and validity in qualitative research. And part is due to my being, an editor on some of these journals. But that has nothing to do with it. For me, rigor and validity have nothing to do with getting published. Here's what it's about. It's about the fact that you put out a call for participants, for people to come forth, and you ask them to pull up all of their vulnerabilities, and they put it before you, and they trust you with their stories, and they trust that you will handle their stories with care. They trust that you will represent their voices in a way that they would want their voices represented, right? In the spaces that they would want them represented. So I would say always, 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 always center the voice of your participants. Center the voice of those who are marginalized in the literature. In your lit review, where are those marginalized folks? And in what ways are you attending to if they're not in the literature, right? And so centering the voices of those who ought to be centered. Trust yourself, center voices, be awesome qualitative researchers.
Yeah, and I think that's important to listen to these words, and just remember for the to the younglings in the crowd, we all had to start somewhere. I don't think we just became quality researchers overnight. This has been a journey for all of us.
Continues.
And for me, it's a journey that has been almost 18 years since I started my master's program. Like, I really became a quality researcher by training and trade. And I'm still learning, and we're still figuring things out, and we are still finding answers, and we're still navigating uncertainties, because that's what it is. So I just gotta express my gratitude to Cynthia, to Boni, for what was not. I mean, first of all, kind of a nice homecoming of sorts, because the three of us, we go constantly to ICQI, and we have become family in a way, kind of a qualitative family in a way. So it's nice to see the qualitative fam answering the call, coming together, hanging out, dispensing wisdom and knowledge and experience with the young learners who are here, the ones in the YouTube, follow the webinar on YouTube. My gratitude for your time, for your generosity, for the ideas that you dispensed and you shared with all of us. I think the thoughts you expressed today are going to help these students come up with really, really powerful literature reviews. Just as yesterday, we heard powerful ideas on how to construct conceptual frameworks. So I think the ideas that we heard in the past two classes from 5 tremendous qualitative scholars are going to help the students write even better proposals than they could have just if they weren't just listening to me and me alone. Because I think it's important is listening to the polyphony of voices that we are, listening to the multiplicity of identities that we bring to the table, and understanding to the young ones that you are part of a community. That those of us who do qualitative research in general, we think of ourselves as part of a larger community that comes together at different moments. Sometimes we call it conferences, sometimes we call it something else, but that we come together and that you are already part of this community. And if you reach out to us, the majority of us will listen and the majority of us will talk back and will give you ideas and we'll exchange ideas with you. So with that, yes, Boni.
Toward that end, I do want to offer to your students, if they have further questions, please go to Raúl, and he has my email. Please, by all means, use me as a resource. Part of a community is not being afraid to reach out and do those things.
Same here. And I'm putting my email in the chat for anyone interested. Make sure I spelled it right.
So there you have it. So now you have 2 more colleagues, 2 more friends that are walking the path with you. So with that, on that note, we're ending today's open lecture webinar, part of an effort from the master's to the MA in Learning and Teaching Processes in Second Languages, and from the research component with a lot of help with the Learning in Second Languages project, the Qualitative Inquiry Connections group on Facebook. To everyone who followed this webinar, I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did in these 2 hours that we had of conversation. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a good afternoon, and let's all, under the circumstances, let's all stay safe. Let's stay connected, and let's stay together.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody.